My guest today is Professor Arthur Caplan, and we're going to talk about vaccinations. All right, Professor, why don't you introduce yourself?
So I'm the head of the Division of Medical Ethics at the NYU Grossman School of Medicine, and my background is philosophy. I'm actually a PhD in philosophy, been working in the medical ethics space for about, 40 years. Prior to NYU at the University of Pennsylvania, prior to that at the University of Minnesota.
The first question I want to start with is what your position on vaccine mandates are.
Well, I was very strong for vaccine mandates, but to answer that, it depends on who we're talking about. So in healthcare settings, nursing homes and hospitals and home care facilities, absolutely believe in vaccine mandates for the workforce, all of the workforce, nurses, cleaners, food prep, and visitors. You had horrible outbreaks of COVID in nursing homes that killed a huge percentage of people in some of these homes. I think you also need to mandate flu shots. So when we have a population at risk, nursing homes, prisons, homes for the developmentally disabled, absolutely believe that vaccination is not an option. I, by the way, came up with the law that mandates flu shots for all healthcare workers in most states. Proposed it some time ago, pushed it through. Mandates for kids to go to school for measles, mumps, rubella, absolutely. They work. They've suppressed those diseases effectively. They're starting to come back now that those mandates have been weakened, but they made sense. They really worked. They kept us almost in a situation where we had been close to eradicating measles in the United States. And by the way, mandates in other countries as well. The toll taken by diseases like measles is still about 50,000 kids a year in Africa. If they could enforce or bring about a mandate and get the adequate supplies, I'd be for it. On the other hand, there are people who don't really need mandates because they're at home and they're working from home and they don't really interact with others, or the people that they do interact with are kind of temporary and quick. They could wear masks if they wanted to go to the store and this sort of thing in the middle of a big outbreak. So I think it depends on who.
Do you think that if there were a healthcare worker who had some sort of objection to it, let's say some sort of conscientious objection, do you think that should be honored?
So it's interesting. When I first came up with the flu mandate idea, I was back at Penn. It was already 11 years ago. And it was in the children's hospital where we had 3 kids die, neonates, newborns, in the neonatal ICU of flu. So I said, we need a mandate here. The voluntary vaccination of the healthcare workforce was only producing 65% participation from nurses. That's not enough to achieve real immunity for the environment that they're working in. Some nurses did object. And my position was, if you don't have a health reason and you want to be a healthcare worker, you have to accept vaccination. End of story. And you can back that up, and I did in some writings, by looking at their own codes of ethics, which I didn't write, but they say put patient interests first. They don't say for nurses, doctors, and pharmacists, put my choices first. That's not principle 1 of any of their codes of ethics. It's always patients first, do no harm, prevent suffering. Nothing said in there about your right to opt out of those duties. So the professions themselves recognize that obligation.
So if a mandate is only profession specific for, people in the healthcare profession, do you think that is consistent with a very liberty focused political philosophy? Because I feel like that's going to be the main objection.
It absolutely will be the main objection. And let me add, by the way, mandates certainly should exist for daycare, for people who are working in the airline industry. I don't think you want your attendants unvaccinated in a 7-hour flight in a little cylinder. So highly contagious environment there. There are certainly many companies who require and mandate vaccination. If you want to work in the oil industry, you want to be in the military and sit in a submarine for 6 months with 200 other people. So I don't want to say it's just healthcare workers. There are plenty of occupations where you are in close proximity and the military needs people ready to fight. So mandates make sense for a large swath of Americans. It's not tiny. That all said, it does seem to me that an ethic emerged just around the time Trump got elected the first time that said, look, what we value the most in society is my choice, my freedom, my liberty, my autonomy. And I should be free to listen to the facts and make a choice, whether it's vaccines, masking, sending my kid to school. I think some more libertarian folks may argue even for things like wearing seatbelts and having fluoride in the water and you name it. I don't agree. I think that ethic is wrong. I think we never called it out. I think there are situations like having traffic rules where you don't get to do what you want because it would be mayhem. And so you have to yield to what's best for the community. And in situations where you're going to put others at risk by your behavior, then you can limit your choices. And the founder of modern, if you will, liberalism, the founder of modern political philosophy, is the book On Liberty by John Stuart Mill. But even Mill recognized my right to do what I want ends at the tip of your nose, meaning if I'm swinging my arms and I'm punching you in the face, that's not acceptable liberty. And that's the general idea of harm. And since viruses got up and have reached plague status, let's not forget the flu, swine flu, let's remember SARS. There have been a number of these outbreaks where the only way you can control them is not by voluntary vaccination or voluntary isolation or voluntary masking. Sometimes to get ahead of a plague, you have to do things that require restriction of liberty.
Yeah, that makes sense. So Travis Reeder argued that we can't demand that other people get vaccinated because it's an intimate action, because you're, injecting some chemical into your body, you're breaking the skin. What do you think about that?
Well, I think it says wrong. I think public health in certain situations can override the normal liberty to decide what goes in my body or what treatments I get. They can certainly do that for children who do not have autonomy yet and can't make choices. So it's in their best interest to presume that vaccination would keep them alive. So at least up until 18, we're not even arguing about an intimate choice. We're just arguing about what's best for the kids, a best interest standard. And I think vaccination meets that. But if you have a situation in many instances where somebody says there's going to be a need to save a child, let's say, during pregnancy, and the only way to do that is to have a C-section, you can refuse that, but only up to a point. At some point, they step in and try to save you and the baby. We have situations where surgery has been authorized for people who are refusing it on the grounds that they don't really understand the consequences fully. So he's right. The presumption should be your choice. The presumption should be your liberty. It's the burden on people like me who want to override that to say the consequences are too big, the danger to others too great to give you that choice.
Are you going to make, or do you make a distinction between like government mandates and private sector mandates, or do you think they fall under the same ethical guidelines?
No, I think there are two types of mandates. Their government only has the authority to compel behavior in certain circumstances, but companies have long had the ability to compel a variety of behaviors if you want to work with them. So some places say, no beards. It's unhygienic or it's dangerous to the hygiene is necessary to make the product we're making because it's so, a scrub room, a safe room. You got to wear a full body suit to work here, like a protective suit. In many industries, people mandate headphones, protect your hearing. They mandate that you wear monitors to detect radiation. So there are job-based mandates, by the way, been in place for decades, unchallenged by the wave of people now who are defending liberty everywhere. And I do think a private entity could say, you don't have a right to work here. We have the right to hire and fire you at will, which is what America has always believed about employment for many businesses. And here's the safe conditions of working here.
Yeah, that makes sense. And that seems to be consistent with the libertarian position, right? Private businesses can decide to do what they want.
Yes. I mean, basically, I think it's government entities who challenge the private sector imposition of any mandates, whether it's vaccines or masking or wearing protective gear, whatever it is. Ironically, libertarians and those more on the choice end of the spectrum as the guiding value, they get the idea that a business is a private association. It is free to set terms. You don't have a right to be there. We don't have a right to work. We don't have a right to employment by anybody. You could create them. Some countries have. That may shift the moral scale, if you will, toward government interacting with what business does. But we're the most business-friendly nation I know of in terms of letting the business impose standards.
So you wrote an article about the unvaccinated and having them be financially liable. I was curious to learn more about that.
So if you, in the middle of a plague, wind up getting sick and you knew about vaccination and you declined to get it, and then you showed up at the ICU, you're taking out resources that arguably could have been used for others. Now, I understand vaccines aren't perfect, so even the vaccinated sometimes wound up sick. But if you knowingly turned it down in the middle of a public health emergency, which was declared, then I think you could pay a bigger copay. It's like if you smoke, insurance company's going to charge you more.
So you're saying that the insurance companies would be justified in doing that, just like for smoking?
Yes. Engage in dangerous or risky behavior. Life insurance companies penalize you if you fly small airplanes because they crash a lot. If they get your weight and you're very heavy, copay to buy the insurance. It goes, there are plenty of those instances. If you're riding around in a car crash and you didn't have your seatbelt on, there's going to be penalties.
So this leads to my next question, which is about holding people responsible. So it seemed like to me that a lot of good faith people, and not necessarily dumb people, were refusing vaccinations. And I think it was because there was a lot of misinformation out there. And for a person who really isn't an expert, it's hard to kind of navigate this information, right? Like you don't know exactly who to trust. You hear this person say this, you hear another person say that. And so maybe people just kind of listen to the people who they generally trust on other issues as well. And so if you have this very open system, like the internet where anybody can write anything, right? Is it really fair to hold people responsible?
Well, I think it is, because at the end of the day, while you can collect information, if medical organizations, professional societies, expert groups say, this is the way we have to go to fight a plague, whatever the cause might be, then I don't think Joe Rogan stands up. And I don't think I care a lot about what RFK Jr. has to tell me. What I care about is what's the American Association of Pediatrics got to tell me. That's the standard that has to guide medicine. By the way, that's the standard that's going to be used in court. It's not going to be Joe Rogan. You're not going to be able to go into court and say, I didn't do X because Art Caplan has a podcast and he told me, don't worry about airbags in your car. You don't need them. Shut them off. I think you can rely on God to protect you when you drive. That's information, but it's not going to wash. So we did have an assault on expertise, which I found unfortunate. As you said, anybody can say anything and anybody seemed to count as much as anybody else. I don't think that was handled well during the pandemic, the COVID pandemic, either here or Europe or other places. We also had situations in terms of holding people responsible where they would lie fake vaccine card, not buy the right kind of mask or not wear it in the right circumstance. That's responsible behavior. They know what they're supposed to be doing and they're trying to evade it. So that seems to me to be not only culpable, but even punishable. And then you have situations also, aside from just disinformation. To put it bluntly, I don't think the medical community communicated well. There were spokespeople like Fauci, but for every Fauci, there were 50 social media disinformers. So the scientific and medical and public health communities didn't get out there with messaging that was loud, corrective, locally delivered. They didn't fight a good fight on social media. They learned, I think, the hard way that they didn't take the disinformation side of the street seriously.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying. I feel like there are maybe like two aspects to my question, right? Like one is that it's hard for me, or at least I'm a little resistant to hold the layperson responsible for an issue that's so complicated because it's so easily to get misled on the internet, right? So that's like one aspect. And then the other aspect is, I guess, what we actually do about the fact that people can say whatever they want on the internet, right? The aspect of like censorship, right? Because on the one hand, I would agree with you. Like, if I were to pick a side, I'm going to go with what the medical associations have to say, because I'm not an expert. I don't do this type of research, and so I have to rely on testimony, right? And if it's one person like RFK Jr., or even if that person is like a doctor, I'm probably going to go with like the association, but that may actually fail in some instances as a reliable source of attaining knowledge, right? Because you do have, I guess, trailblazers or people who've been ostracized by perhaps like a professional community, but maybe they actually turn out to be right. Maybe in 1 in 100 cases, they actually turn out to be right.
Well, my comment is you're right. However, that's odds that you can't chase in a pandemic. My friend Peter Hotez, immunologist, vaccinologist down at Baylor, has computed that in red states, they probably had 200,000 excess preventable deaths because of the failure to vaccinate. Well, that's a pretty high price to pay for respecting the outlier view.
No, that's true. I think it's also hard for the layperson to weigh that against, I guess, the fear that some people get when they hear about perhaps the dangers of vaccinations or maybe the potential side effects, right? And again, I'm not talking about people who are mean-spirited or disingenuous. I mean people who really just don't know, and they're just hearing different accounts, and then there's like one person who actually might be like a doctor, right? Who has an outlying position, but they say it so confidently, and what they say sounds scary. I mean, it's funny that you mentioned Joe Rogan and RFK Jr. because I recently listened to that interview, right? And it's like, oh, this guy, I mean, he has strong opinions.
Yeah.
It sounds like he knows what he's saying, right? He's not a scientist himself, but I can imagine a scientist saying very similar things.
Well, certainly the tone and the style can be imitated in terms of confidence that a doctor or scientist might bring to a discussion. But it's up to the scientific and medical community to remind people there's always dissenters. That's what science is. Science never speaks with unanimity. And I think the public doesn't understand that. If it heard dissent, then it started to think, well, they're not sure. I've got to protect my kid, or I don't want to make myself sick. So I'm going to go with the safer course, which may seem to me to be don't vaccinate. I don't see, anybody in my immediate neighborhood dropping dead from COVID or flu or whatever it might be. Science has to do a much better job of saying a couple of things. Science is science because it's fallible. So things change, facts change, views can change. When we move from saying the vaccine would prevent you from getting COVID to saying the vaccine would make COVID less deadly, but you could still catch it, a lot of people said, whoa, that seems to be a shift in position that makes me think you don't know what you're talking about. But new strains of virus appeared. It wasn't well explained. science also has a graveyard of great ideas that it loved that it had to bury because they were wrong. Religion and ideology don't. Weirdly, the stronger and more confident you are, the less willing you are to concede that you could be wrong or that you have been wrong about things in the past. That's not science anymore. Now you're doing, like I say, ideological or faith-based beliefs. The other comment I would make is, look, the issue of vaccination, masking, these became pure politics. At some point, it shifted from a debate about information and choice to political allegiance. If the Republicans said, you want to be a real Republican, Ron DeSantis, don't vaccinate, don't do anything, don't put your kids in quarantine, go to school, keep your job, we're open for tourism. That was political talk. It had nothing to do with somebody saying, oh, mRNA vaccines, I don't know, are they safe? So we did shift into a political fight. And again, I think that wasn't properly called out. It was as if everybody got the right information on the internet, they'd make the right choice. Well, I don't think it's that simple.
What do we do about scientific dissenters, right? Like you said, there's always going to be people who dissent,
Sure.
right? Do we silence them because it's a global pandemic?
Well, I think we qualify them. It's one thing to be a dissenter. There were plenty, by the way, in the AIDS epidemic who said it's not the HIV virus. Now, we know that we're wrong because we've used killing the HIV virus to control AIDS. So they were wrong. But before we had cures or interventions like PrEP pills and so on, I remember the head of science in South Africa said, whatever it is, it's not the HIV virus. And that was a pretty high up official. So have you studied and published on the subject? Yes or no? A lot of the dissenters, no. They're just sitting in their den and, saying, I don't know, this is how it appears to me. Are you anybody who has ever in the past worked in the space? A lot of these people were pediatricians or scientists or doctors, but they weren't people who had any experience with vaccines. I would see what they said about the development of the COVID vaccine, and I knew that they were just wrong. The thing had been worked on, not for COVID, but for Zika and MERS, 12 years before we rolled it out for COVID. It wasn't rushed. What was rushed was the purchase of the vaccine so that you could distribute it quickly. But the science was never rushed. So you knew that there were people talking about vaccine dangers who didn't know anything about vaccine manufacturing and how long it takes to deploy vaccines. The other thing is sometimes scientists are a little unwilling to call out their colleagues who don't know what they're talking about. But I think it's a violation of professional ethics. They should challenge their medical license and say, this guy's causing huge harm or woman in an outbreak. We want the board to look at the license. And we didn't get enough of that either.
That sounds like a way to silence dissent.
It doesn't silence it. It just says if you're going to spout dissent and you don't know what you're talking about, you're not going to do it as a licensed doctor. You're just going to do it as Art Caplan.
I see. Okay, so there can be some limitations or we can dish out some punishments for dissenters.
Without complete censorship. It's just, if you want to claim you're doing this under the mantle of medical expertise, and medicine thinks not only you're wrong, but you're dangerous, then medicine should do some policing.
Okay. So let's think of like a hypothetical scenario. Let's say that it's about, COVID vaccinations, and you do have a dissenter, but this dissenter is an expert on vaccines. Okay. Would you be completely in favor of hosting or just like seeing a debate hosted on in public events on television at university campuses between, this person and another person who's in favor of COVID vaccines?
Yeah, I hate that idea of debates. What matters is consensus, not a debate. I can find people who will debate, did the Holocaust happen? I can find people who will debate almost anything. There's always somebody with credentials who says, I'm a legitimate historian, and I don't think that event occurred, or you're making it up. I think that there are many people who would want to debate evolution endlessly. But to me, the case is closed. by the time you've got geologists and oil explorers presuming evolution to be true, to look for places where oil might be from dead fossilized animals from a zillion years ago, you can pretty much say we're not debating this anymore, and we don't have to set up forums to hear the dissent. You can espouse the dissent, but what science continually needs to do is say, A, here's the consensus, not the dissent. It's not a one-on-one, it's a 1 to 1,000 kind of situation. And when we have practical consequences, we can fix a disease, you can't. We can find oil on your theory of 6,000-year creationism, you can't. Here's pictures of ovens and people's bones. You don't have anything to refute this. I don't care how much you dissent. So I know people want to turn many of the science subjects and medicine subjects into sort of debate formats or debate challenges. And scientists do debate things. I'm not even arguing that. But when you're trying to make a policy recommendation, you're trying to say, what does the vast majority of science believe? That's where you draw your lines.
Yeah, I would agree with that. If you're making a policy decision, you would go for, the official, association's position or the majority's position. I guess like in terms of me, because I'm a philosopher, I'm just like interested in attaining the truth, right? And because again, like I'm not an expert, I have to rely on other people's testimony. And for me, I feel like one helpful way to do that is to have them talk to each other, and for me to just listen.
Well, I mean, there may be formats where the consequences are nothing more than a dialogue. I've debated creationists myself in the past, and I don't consider that a open question. I mean, I think it's closed as to whether evolution, drove life on this planet. There are certainly dissenters among evolutionary biologists as to what's more important, what factors are key. Is it speciation? Is it microevolution? There's a lot of differing opinion that way. And laying it out once in a while in a debate or a TV documentary is fine. But when you're in the middle of a public health emergency, a plague that's killing worldwide millions, it's a weird time to have a debate.
The other concern that I have is what unintended side effects there will be if people perceive that speech is being silenced, right? I think some people are, I guess maybe they're more prone to be conspiracy theorists, but if they perhaps hear about this person's, YouTube channel being taken down, or this person's, losing his credentials and losing his job, they're going to think, oh, like, what are they trying to hide?
Yeah. Well, my response to that, Jason, is I'm not sure I want to take anything down, and I'm not sure I trust Mark Zuckerberg or his ilk, Musk, to sort of be the monitor of valid speech or valid information. It's clear right now that universities don't know what to do about Palestine and Israel. Even the free speech people I know are screeching that they think there's too much pro-Palestinian speech, or they don't want demonstrations, or they don't want speakers coming. So it's not like it's all a bunch of, shall we say, more liberal-leaning scientists. The right-wing free speech proponents apparently have their limits too about what they want to hear. I'd rather see us argue about how to beef up respectable speech, legitimate speech, expert speech, than I would take down conspiracy speech or disinformation speech. I hate to say it, but you know what? Before the internet, there were all those forms of disinformation and malarkey speech. For a long time in the United States, the John Birch Society was powerful, and all it did was have meetings. There were plenty of politicians who met and said things that were wrong about race or about immigration. They didn't have social media. They got elected to governorships and sometimes ran for president. Think of George Wallace here. So, yes, we have a more powerful media that has a bigger and easier megaphone, but we've had, let's call it, malarkey or nonsense speech around for quite some time, and it spreads.
All right, last question. So in terms of how you think dialogues about controversial issues should be handled? Like, you're okay with public forums? Like, you said you're not really in favor of debates, or at least maybe debate about crucial issues during a pandemic.
Right. Well, what I'm in favor of is I don't want to debate in front of the Department of Public Health of Connecticut about whether we should vaccinate with a dissenter and a legitimate expert. I want to know right away, what do the experts think we have to do quickly to shut down this deadly plague, whatever it might be, future one or now. In other contexts, in a high school class, I'd like to see presentations of information that are drawn from the internet and attempts to teach why this is science and that isn't, which we don't do anymore. Even weirdly, when I ask my med students at NYU, what's science? What makes something scientific? They don't know how to answer. They'll sometimes say things like, well, it's appeared in the New England Journal of Medicine. I'm not sure that makes it scientific. It's a stamp of approval of a sort, peer review and all that, but those aren't the methods used to generate warranted belief. So, depends on the setting. There are occasions where I could easily tolerate a debate as long as it's made clear that it's a minority position against a majority position. I might even say, oh yeah, well, you know what? Set the debate up this way. One minority dissenter gets to debate 5 majority consensus people. People say, well, that's not fair. That's actually how it looks on the issue. So make the debate look how it appears on the issue to the majority of the scientific community if you want to make a scientific claim. Teach scientists how to communicate. We've said this again and again today, but they're not trained to do it. They don't get rewarded for public speech. They get penalized. Your career can be in jeopardy as a doctor, scientist, researcher, particularly in academia if you wind up engaging on social media, writing op-eds for the local newspaper. People say, well, that's not your job. Your job is to generate new knowledge. No, it isn't. Your job is also to communicate that new knowledge. The public pays for science, either through tax breaks or government grants through places like the NIH. Let's empower science to communicate better, more clearly, train people, reward the people that do it. Again, I'll say this. The listeners can think to themselves, name 10 scientists they could name speaking during the pandemic, then name 10, let's call them alternate points of view that they could name during the pandemic. That you can do. Everybody can do that. They heard those voices. Fix it.
Thank you so much for joining me. I think it's a good place to wrap things up.
Very good. I enjoyed it.